In this video, we will consider the contributions of St. John of the Cross, who was a student of St. Teresa of Avila. Back in the 16th century, John of the Cross wrote a classic poem entitled Dark Night of the Soul. In his poem, which St. John would later expand and make into a powerful book, he explains the basic tenets of Christian mysticism. And for our purposes, I want us to focus on St. John's book. And I want to start by considering the meaning of the book's title, Dark Night of the Soul. I mean, at one level, the title is easy to understand. Everybody has a soul, and everybody has gone through tough times or dark nights. During those hard times in life, it feels like we're all alone and lost in the dark. That's pretty easy to understand. We've all been there. We've all felt it. But I think there's a second, deeper meaning to the book's title that relates to our study of Christian mysticism. St. John of the Cross asks us to consider what would happen if, during a sunshiny summer's day, we decided to stare intently up at the bright sun in the sky. If we fixed our naked eyes directly into the sun and held our gaze for an extended period of time, it would damage our vision. We would ultimately risk blindness, and everything we saw would eventually go dark. That's exactly the idea captured in the book title, Dark Night of the Soul. When you feel you're in the darkest pit of your life, when you feel awful and all alone with your problems and fears, when everything around you seems dark and hopeless, that's exactly the time God is closest to you. Now, let's stop for a minute. Maybe I've just confused you. What I just said sounds strange on the surface, but the idea of St. John is that God's brilliance, God's perfect love, His infinite power, God's light is actually with you during your times of greatest suffering. The problem is, when you're in a tough situation, when you feel like you've fallen into a dark pit of disaster, at that moment, you can't see or feel God's presence in your life. I mean, you feel alone and besieged, but you're not. God is right there with you, but you can't see Him. This is because the brightness of God's presence is so bright, so intense, so close, that you can't comprehend it. Not in the moment. I mean, you're blinded to His close proximity. That's because God's love and power are so overwhelming to our human senses. Just like if we were to foolishly stare into a summer sun until our vision was lost and everything went dark. The same idea holds true when you face dark times in your life. I can't help but wonder if even Jesus Christ experienced something like this during His life. In the Bible's book of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 46, it described how Jesus was dying on the cross during His crucifixion. It was a horrible moment. And in that instant, even Jesus felt that God had abandoned Him. Jesus cried out, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" Perhaps Jesus Christ experienced a dark night of the soul. But it was precisely at that terrible moment that Jesus was on the verge of His greatest victory. 3 days later, Jesus went on to conquer death. Look, I agree. This is extreme. This is mind-blowing stuff that St. John is offering us. But stay with me on this. Let's keep going. St. John of the Cross teaches about three different things. First, he talks about the cleansing of both the sensual person and the spiritual person. That word we talked about earlier in this video series, purgation, comes back into the discussion right here. Second, John talks about something he calls unitive contemplation, which is a concept we'll explore later in this video series. And third, St. John talks about how union with God prompts what are called spiritual touches by God. When we're in deep unity of contemplation, it's these resulting spiritual touches that transform us and improve us as people. So, these are some fundamental and important concepts in Christian mysticism offered to us by St. John of the Cross. And this raises a subtle point that I want to briefly mention. What is the difference between the words meditation and contemplation? Most people use these terms interchangeably, and in everyday conversation, that's probably okay, but I want you to be aware that there's a difference. Meditation is inwardly focused on centering and calming the self for the purpose of achieving greater clarity, mindfulness, and a more healthful state of being. By contrast, contemplation accomplishes much of the same thing, but it does so by outwardly and upwardly focusing the human consciousness. Contemplation seeks to develop a closer personal relationship with the divine, with God. Again, this is a rather advanced distinction. Most people don't even know there's a difference between meditation and contemplation. But since you're investing your time to learn about Christian mysticism, I wanted to make sure you're aware. There's still more we need to learn from St. John. Allow me to read a short excerpt from John's book, which talks about the duality that exists within each of us. By duality, I'm suggesting that there's a higher spiritual part of the human consciousness and also a lower sensuality. John says the human spirit, which is the higher aspect of human consciousness, takes delight in knowing God. By comparison, the lower, soulish, sensual nature of a person seeks pleasure through our bodily feelings and our physicality. But what does all this mean? Okay, this is where it gets pretty wild, because I talked about this very thing a few years ago when I wrote my first book. I did a lot of study of contemporary brain science. I also was mentored and trained in an easy-to-understand model of the human brain and how the brain actually works. Basically, to keep things simple, you can think of the human brain as consisting of just two parts, an upper part and a lower part. Think of it this way. The upper part of the brain is where our higher consciousness or our human spirit lives. It's in the upper part of the brain that a higher order of thinking takes place. Love, compassion, mercy, all of humanity's best thinking lives in the top part of the brain. But there's also a lower half of the brain, and it's there in the lower part of the human brain that we have many of our survival instincts and sexual appetites and primal emotions. It's the lower part of the brain that sometimes gets us into trouble. It can prompt us to make poor life choices or become caught up in unhealthy behaviors and so on. Now, this isn't always the case with the lower part of the brain, but too often problems do arise from there. I find it interesting that St. John's book, Dark Night of the Soul, a work written hundreds of years ago by a medieval Catholic priest, it's still useful today. Let me give you a quick summary of the Dark Night of the Soul. Basically, the idea is that when we're united with God through advanced forms of prayer and contemplation, this is what St. John calls infused contemplation, God can clean up or purge the toxic attachments that are rooted in the lower part of the human brain. It's incredible how some of St. John's old terminology fits beautifully and is relevant to our present-day efforts at helping people recover from bad habits and toxic dysfunctional behaviors. Much of St. John's writing dovetails nicely with modern psychology and contemporary mental health practices. Because, as you know, today, people are still battling their human attachments and struggling with their bad habits, just as people did in medieval times. But in his book, St. John of the Cross describes this approach called infused contemplation, which addresses the modern problem of addiction. Infused contemplation has also become one of the cornerstones behind Christian-style mysticism. So let's talk a little more about how infused contemplation works. Basically, by adopting a lifestyle of prayer and contemplation, it's as if a door opens in your life. By embracing a prayerful lifestyle, you grant God permission, or think of it as you invite God into your life. You engage with God so that He can do transformational miracles and develop and grow your spirituality. When your spiritual self grows and matures, the result is you build character and become a better person. St. John wrote that, I'm going to quote, "The divine assails the soul in order to renew it, stripping it of the habitual affections and attachments of the old man," that's the former self, "to which it is conformed," end quote. This way of thinking is powerful. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss how this approach ties back to what the Apostle Paul talked about in the Bible's book of Romans in chapters 7 and 8. I also don't have time in this video series to talk about how the 20th century theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer powerfully wrote about the importance of conforming ourselves to the life and image of Jesus Christ. I'll leave all that discussion for one of my future workshops or training presentations. But for our purposes here, I want to go on and say that St. John taught how it is by a spiritual enkindling that the human soul breaks its addictions and bad habits. John offers a mind-blowing illustration of how humanity can be transformed and made better. It all starts with each individual, with you and me. Each of us must focus on the purgation of bad habits. We talked about this purgation idea before. Basically, it's all about getting rid of our dysfunctional, toxic habits. But how does it happen? Ultimately, it happens through a supernatural act of God. Yes, you and I have an initial role to play. Yes, it's important that we take action and make early efforts to clean ourselves up as best we can. I've discussed this in other videos from this series where we talked about joining a 12-step program or seeking professional counseling, entering rehab, and so on. But the great majority, the bulk of the work done in our personal transformation is accomplished by God Himself. St. John writes, and I'll quote again, "God grants the soul the favor of purging it and healing it of all the imperfect habits and affections with respect to temporal things and to natural sensual things being dried up and its natural energies being attenuated and weakened. God makes it to die," end quote. So, 12-step programs, therapeutic counseling, rehab, and detox programs. All these are important and useful for people in recovery. But the ultimate path to healing, I believe, is something spiritual. St. John wrote that the sin in our lives must die. Ooh, there's a churchy word, sin. Tons of baggage and shame associated with that word, for sure. But what do I mean by sin? Here's the way I want to use that word. I'm talking about the obsessions, the damaging effects of past trauma in your life, the consequences of all those times when somebody else hurt you or you suffered some sort of injustice or violence. Whatever the root cause that first prompted you to seek out unhealthy ways to self-medicate your pain, to try to numb your physical or emotional wounds. Maybe you've become not a very nice person because of your trauma history. Maybe you've stolen things or told lies or hurt others in a twisted and misguided effort to stop feeling bad. Maybe you've been socially conditioned to engage in so-called sinful behaviors. Maybe you get triggered by things and circumstances that happen to you in your daily environment, and then you respond in unhealthy or unkind or even cruel ways. I want you to consider all the manifestations of your brokenness and your maladaptive behaviors. I mean, the term sin can cover a lot of ground, but St. John is teaching us about how all our messy thoughts, our behaviors, our unhealthy attitudes can be dried up, attenuated, and weakened. John is saying that the real you can finally be set free. Let me be honest for a moment. It's going to take a miracle of healing to change you. But the good news is God does miracles. Right now, you're watching and listening to someone who experienced such a miracle. I mean, 20 years ago, I was a big mess. Today, I'm much better. The goal of my work is to give other people useful tools and information so they don't have to wait 20 years or more before experiencing their own breakthroughs. But wrapping up and moving on, in my next video, I'm going to share with you an amazing illustration given to us by St. John of the Cross. St. John powerfully demonstrates his spiritual ideas through an incredible visual metaphor. Let me try and whet your appetite and give you a quick hint. Have you ever been to an outdoor bonfire event? Trust me, you don't want to miss the important lesson in the next video. I hope you're enjoying this series. Thank you for watching. And please check out my ericrod.com website and be sure to subscribe to my mailing list. See you next time.